Everyone knows Donald Duck's nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Lewey, but did you know those weren't supposed to be their names? In an episode of Ducktales, the triplets' real mom, Della Duck, finally comes back from the moon, and she was missing since the boys were eggs, so this was her first time ever seeing her actual kids, and she was surprised to hear that their names were Huey, Dewey, and Lewey, because she told Donald Duck that their names were going to be Jet, Turbo, and Rebel. Well, Donald must have forgotten and called an audible with rhyming names. But what's ironic is these names that the ducks were supposed to have actually match each duck's personality. Dewey was supposed to be Turbo. He's off the walls, energetic, and always ready to charge forward into adventure. Also, it can't be a coincidence that he wears blue, his name was supposed to be Turbo, and he's voiced by the same guy that voices Sonic. Then we have Lewey, who was supposed to be Rebel, and that one's obvious given that Louie's always up to trouble. And finally, Huey was supposed to be Jet, which I think is an homage to Della Duck's piloting skills. And this relates to Huey's ability to navigate any situation with a level head. So which names do you like better for the triplets? Huey, Dewey, and Lewey, or Jet, Turbo, and Rebel? Do you know how Huey, Dewey, and Lewey got their names? Everyone knows Donald Duck's nephews, but before they were born, Della Duck, their mom, told Donald to name them Jet, Turbo, and Rebel, and she even wrote it on a piece of paper just in case no one could understand Donald. So how did we end up with Huey, Dewey, and Lewey? Well, we can thank Donald Duck's notorious bad luck for that. During their hatching, a series of unfortunate events happened at the hospital, and they all happened to Donald Duck. And after each accident, he said his famous catchphrase, "Ah, Phooey." And once the boys hatched, Donald Duck got so worked up and in a fit of rage, he yelled, "Phooey, Phooey, Phooey." And the nurses had no idea what was going on and of course had no idea what he said. And so they thought he was screaming out their names. And instead of hearing Phooey 3 times, they actually heard Huey, Dewey, and Lewey. And so that's what the kids' names ended up being. So sadly, Dewey was never able to be Turbo. All thanks to Donald Duck's anger problem. Everyone knows Donald Duck's nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Lewey. But did you know they have a different name depending on which language you watch the show in? In Russian, they're known as Billy, Willy, and Dilly. In French, they're Riri, Fifi, and Lulu. In Italian, they're Qui, Quo, and Qua. In German, they call them Tick, Trick, and Track. In Danish, they're Rip, Rap, and Rup. In Spanish, they're Juanito, Jorgito, and Pedrito. In Finnish, they're Tupu, Hupu, and Lupu. Then in Norwegian, for some reason, they're Ole, Dole, and Dolphin. And then my personal favorite is Dutch, where their names are Quick, Quack, and Quack, as a duck should be named. And of course, we can't forget what their names really were supposed to be, which is Jet, Turbo, and Rebel. So what names do you know these triplets as? The triplets from DuckTales have to have the worst names I've ever heard. Sure, Huey, Dewey, and Lewey sounds fine, but do you know their full names? Let's start with the least bad name, but still bad, Huey. Huey's full name is Hubert Duck. Not terrible, but definitely could use some work. Next we have Louis. No, Lewis is not his full name. Instead, it's Llewellyn Duck, which is technically a boy's name, but it must be tough growing up with a boy's name that sounds like a girl's name. And then we have the worst of them all, and that's Dewey's real name. His full name is Doofer Dingus Duck. Yeah, that's his actual name in DuckTales. The worst possible first name mixed with the worst possible middle name. And in the original DuckTales, it's not much better. His name was Deuteronomy D. Duck. Man, maybe their mom never should have went to the moon so she could give him some real names like Jet, Turbo, and Rebel. Now that sounds so much better than Dinkus. Did you know that Donald Duck has a 4th nephew? Everyone knows the triplets Huey, Dewey, and Lewey, but did you know there was a 4th brother? And his name was Phooey. Their mother, Della Duck, thought she was only gonna have 3 kids because there were 3 eggs. But in one of the eggs was a smaller second embryo. And when they all hatched, there were 4 boys. Huey, Dewey, Lewey, and Phooey. But Phooey was so small, frail, and weak that he didn't make it out of the hospital alive. And that's where Donald Duck's catchphrase was born. "Ah, Phooey," mourning the death of his nephew. And this is why he's so overprotective of the boys, so he never has to experience this again. And this is why the boys have a shared dream of their younger brother and are convinced that there's this mysterious 4th brother. And all of them happen to agree that his name is Phooey. And that's because they all have this vague memory of him when they were born. And in that moment, Phooey Duck did exist, but sadly, it wasn't for long. Who is the father of the triplets in DuckTales? In the first season, Huey, Dewey, and Lewey are obsessed with finding their mom, and that's because she went missing and ended up on the moon. However, during that time, and when she came back, there was no mention of their dad, which is surprising considering that Webby is obsessed with the McDuck family and knows everything about them. But she never questioned anything about their father. So the simple solution for this is that the triplets have no father. As we've seen in this show, it's possible for there to be a parent on their own. Like in the finale when we discovered that Webby was made through Scrooge's DNA and she becomes his daughter. But we can't say the same thing happened with the triplets, because Webby was created inside a tube, while there's proof that the boys hatched from eggs. So the most likely answer is that Della Duck's adventurous spirit got the best of her on a mission. She got too daring and came in contact with an ancient magical artifact, like the Flower of Fertility, that instantly made her pregnant, which is why the boys are so much like their mother, and why they look up to Donald like a father figure, because the answer is they never had a dad. Did you know Webby Vanderquack had 3 more sisters? In the finale of Ducktales, Webby discovers she has 2 sisters, May and June, and they were created using her DNA. However, she also discovers that she was made in a lab too. She finds out she was made by Fowl from Scrooge's DNA, and she was Project April. So the fact that she was Project April suggests she wasn't the first attempt at cloning Scrooge McDuck, considering the 12 months of the year. So Project January, February, and March must have been deleted, likely due to the fact that these clones didn't survive and were failed experiments. It wasn't until Project April, aka Webby, that they were able to perfect the Scrooge clone. But once Beakley saved Webby from Fowl, they weren't able to continue with any more clones until they got Webby's DNA, and that's how Projects May and June came to be. And luckily they had a happier ending than their older sisters January, February, March. Or it could be that Projects January, February, and March are actually Huey, Dewey, and Lewey. After all, we don't know who their dad is, and January is associated with blue, February with red, and March with green, and the boys just so happen to wear blue, red, and green. So Webby either has 3 sisters that didn't survive the cloning process, or 3 brothers in Huey, Dewey, and Lewey. Scrooge McDuck is a grandfather. Yes, that shouldn't be surprising considering he's well over 100 years old, but before the DuckTales reboot, we've only ever known him as an uncle. He's the uncle to Donald and Della Duck, and the great uncle to the triplets Huey, Dewey, and Lewey. And while he has this toxic relationship with Goldie, they never had kids together. Instead, a kid was made from Scrooge's DNA. Bradford took some of Scrooge's feathers to create a clone, and that turned out to be Webby Vanderquack. And so at the end of the series, Scrooge and Webby both accept that this makes her his daughter. However, he's actually a grandfather now, not just a father, because Bradford actually made 2 additional clones, May and June, and these 2 were made from Webby's DNA. So if being made from Scrooge's DNA makes Webby his daughter, then being made from Webby's DNA makes May and June her daughters. So technically, Webby is a mother, and Scrooge has 2 granddaughters. In DuckTales, there's a whole lot of uncles and aunts and nieces and nephews. Huey, Dewey, and Lewey are Donald Duck's nephews, and they're also Scrooge McDuck's nephews, making both Donald and Scrooge uncles. And Daisy will eventually become their aunt through her relationship with Donald. And Webby now has Della and Donald as her aunt and uncle, now that she's technically Scrooge's daughter. But one relationship that doesn't make sense is the relationship of Lena and Magica Dispel. Lena referred to Magica as her evil aunt, but she came from Magica's shadow, so Magica is really her creator and also her mother. But we end up discovering in season 3 that Magica actually had a brother named Poe, and after he turned into a raven, Magica stole his magic and kept it for herself, and Poe was actually the master of shadow magic. So Lena is technically the creation of Poe, making Poe Lena's true father, and thus making Magica Lena's aunt, despite Lena being Magica's shadow. This also might be able to explain why Lena was able to become good, because in the brief flashback we saw of Poe, he was a tad less villainous than his sister, and perhaps that was just enough for Lena to break away from Magica Dispel. But sadly, Poe was never seen in human form ever again. Quoth the Raven, nevermore. Daisy Duck is evil. As we know, Daisy Duck is the long-term girlfriend of Donald Duck. However, she doesn't come into Donald's life until after his adventures with Scrooge. That all takes place in DuckTales. And in that TV show, there's a villain that's after Scrooge and all his wealth called Magica. She was able to transform her shadow into a duck called Lena. And she used Lena to get close to the Duck family, so that she could get close to Scrooge, steal his first dime, and free herself of this curse. And while she may have been unsuccessful because Lena turned on Magica, Magica could could still be attempting the same plan, but this time with a different duck. In an episode of Ducktales, Magica turned Webby into a plush doll that looked exactly like Daisy. And while this was a nightmare, this still means that the concept of Daisy Duck came from Magica's mind. And the Daisy we know could just be another magical shadow or manifestation caused by Magica that is using her relationship with Donald Duck to get close to Scrooge so Magica can take that #1 dime. And poor Donald is falling for all of Daisy Duck's tricks. Everyone knows Daisy Duck as Donald Duck's long-term girlfriend, but do you know how the two lovebirds met? In an episode of Ducktales, Donald Duck and his band, the Three Caballeros, were trying to crash an upscale party. The event was hosted by Emma Glamour, who basically decides what's popular and what isn't. So Donald and his band were trying to play there to impress her. And part of the plan was for Donald to steal the stage pass away from Glamour's assistant, who just so happened to be Daisy Duck. But thanks to Donald's luck, he ended up being stuck in the elevator with her instead. But they got to talking in there. He was so impressed with the dress that she designed, and she was so impressed with his singing voice, even though it was terrible. And when they finally got out of the elevator, the whole party was ruined, and Glamour blamed Daisy Duck for the whole thing. But Donald Duck stood up for her and got Glamour to put Daisy's dress on the it list. And in turn, Daisy stood up for him and got Glamour to let his band play on stage. And even though Donald sounded terrible up there, Daisy Duck loved it because she loved him. Donald Duck is the best cartoon dad, and he isn't even a parent. Him, his Uncle Scrooge, and his sister Della all used to adventure together. But then all of that came to a halt when Della was about to have 3 kids, Huey, Dewey, and Lewey. Or so you would think. Despite these eggs being days away from hatching, Della still wanted to adventure. Not only that, but she wanted to go on the most dangerous adventure yet, a trip to outer space. But Donald Duck told her it was too dangerous and too irresponsible with ducks on the way. So Scrooge built a rocket behind Donald's back, and Della snuck on without anyone knowing so that she could adventure, and she never made it back. Donald was so upset at his family for ignoring his warnings, but regardless of his poor financial situation, he still took Huey, Dewey, and Lewey in, put his adventuring days behind him, and raised them and kept them safe all by himself. And that makes Donald Duck the best adventurer of them all. How did Donald Duck get his super annoying voice? Everyone that's part of the Mickey Mouse gang has a relatively normal voice. Everyone except Donald Duck. He has this high-pitched, raspy and squeaky voice that you can barely understand. Initially, people thought it was to help him sound like a real duck. However, if you look at all of the ducks in DuckTales, Scrooge, Huey, Dewey, Lewey, Webby, and even Daisy Duck, who's not even in DuckTales, every other duck has a somewhat normal voice. So why is Donald's different? Well, there's some concrete evidence that Donald was a part of the Navy back in the day, so it could be due to a throat injury suffered in war. But in one episode of DuckTales, Dewey travels back in time and meets a young kid version of Donald, and he still has that squeaky voice at that age. So that can't be the reason. But in a different episode of DuckTales, Donald is gifted a new voice box and can talk entirely normal. So the reason for Donald Duck's voice being like that is because of his temper tantrums. As a kid, he must have blown out his voice box from yelling and screaming so much, and it's only gotten worse over time, to where now you can hardly comprehend a word that Donald Duck is saying. It's too bad he couldn't keep that new voice box. Is Donald Duck faking his annoying voice? Donald speaks in this squeaky voice no one can understand, and while you'd assume he sounds like a duck because he is a duck, he's actually the only duck in DuckTales that has that voice. Everyone else talks normal, but he was able to talk normally once he finally got a new voice box. So you'd think that his natural voice is that raspy one he has that he got from blowing out his original voice box. However, there's evidence that contradicts that. In an episode of DuckTales, Donald Duck is stranded on an island, so he made a Mickey Mouse head out of melons to talk to so he wouldn't go insane. But when he does the voice for the melon, he's able to do a spot-on, crystal clear Mickey Mouse impression.
Oh boy, I love a reunion! Oh!
So clearly, Donald can talk normally and has intentionally been using this voice that no one can understand. But now the real question is why? To annoy everyone around him? To get people to stop talking to him? Or does he just think this voice is a cool thing to do? Because if that's the case, someone's got to tell him that it's not so he can stop. Did Alvin and the Chipmunks rip off Huey, Dewey, and Lewey? The stars of DuckTales and Donald Duck's nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Lewey started wearing their iconic red, blue, and green in the 1950s. 1950s. Then in the 1960s, Alvin and the Chipmunks started donning these red, green, and blue colors. So did Alvin and the Chipmunks steal this color pattern from them? While it's possible, it's certainly not likely. Because yes, these two are some of the most iconic trios, but no, they aren't the first and won't be the last to wear this color scheme. The Powerpuff Girls wore red, green, and blue, Pokemon starters were red, green, and blue, and even the Three Good Fairies and Sleeping Beauty were red, green, and blue. So this color pattern is a popular cartoon trend that the Chipmunks and the Ducks decided to hop on around the same time. Now the real question is why red, green, and blue when red, blue, and yellow are the primary colors? Well, that's likely because yellow doesn't stick out as much against a white background as green would, therefore giving us the color of the clothes of some of the most iconic trios in cartoon history. While the DuckTales reboot only lasted 3 seasons, it sets up the Disney universe for more reboots to come. Naturally, the first one that comes to mind is Darkwing Duck. They created the in-universe explanation for how Drake Mallard became Darkwing Duck, and how Launchpad and Goslin became his sidekicks. Also, the fact that they never expanded upon Negaduck in DuckTales tells me he'll be a mainstay villain in the Darkwing reboot. Then we have Tailspin, which is getting redone for Disney+. Kit Cloudkicker was introduced in season 3 of DuckTales, and at the end of the episode he goes back to his cloud-kicking ways. Plus, Don Carnage was able to survive his plane crash, and after that he got his hands on an ancient artifact, so he'll certainly be the main villain of that reboot. They also teased a potential reboot of Quack Pack in DuckTales, and they provided us with the Chippendale Rescue Rangers origin story, and a quick appearance of the Goof Troop version of Goofy. And at the very end, Donald Duck teased that he would be taking in May and June, along with Daisy, because in the original comics, they were actually Daisy's nieces. So we could also be seeing a spin-off revolving around Donald, Daisy, May, and June. And of course, you can't forget Donald Duck's best friend, Storkules.